Dr. Sarah Buckley is trained as a GP, a family physician, with qualifications in GP obstetrics. She has been writing and lecturing to childbirth professionals and parents since 1997 and is the author of the international best-selling book, Gentle Birth, Gentle Mothering. She is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Queensland, researching oxytocin in labor and birth and the impact of maternity care interventions. She has co-authored several papers on oxytocin in labor, birth, and breastfeeding. Sarah is also the mother of 4 adult children, all born at home. She lives on the semi-rural outskirts of Brisbane, Australia. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure to be here. And thank you to Thomas Verney for that wonderful introduction to pre and perinatal psychology, and really to everyone for holding that space for the importance of pregnancy, of life in the womb, and of the transition to life outside the womb as well. So I'm bringing some neurobiology to the conversation. And my interest in this, really, a lot of it comes from my own experience of giving birth and the very positive experiences I had with my own 4 children. And then what I learned at medical school about birth and what the general culture image is about birth. And they were quite different. And from that, I became interested in the hormones of labor and birth, and now particularly this hormone oxytocin. And oxytocin is really important when we think about life in the womb, because oxytocin is a hormone. It's a substance that's made in one part of the body with the effects at another part of the body. It was called fast tocin birth because it was first recognized as the hormone that makes birth go fast. But what we know now is that it has immense and positive effects in the brain. And if I asked you what you know about oxytocin, you'd probably reply with things like hormone of love, hormone of calm, monogamy hormone, trust hormone. And these are all effects that happen from oxytocin release within the brain. So what happens with oxytocin? It's a reproductive hormone. We actually release it when we make babies. It's literally the hormone of love. We make love, we make oxytocin at conception, which is really everything we need to know about. We could say Mother Nature's superb design for conception, that we're designed to conceive our babies in love. And then during pregnancy, we get increases in oxytocin. And it's not just oxytocin, the hormone, but oxytocin, like every hormone, is a whole system. So there's the hormone, and then there's what we call the hormone receptor. So the hormone oxytocin is made in the brain, for example, and it's released into the body. And the way it has effects on the brain to make birth go fast is by binding to a specific receptor. So we have oxytocin, which is like a key, the oxytocin receptor like a lock. The key binds to the lock, turns the key, sends a chemical message into the cell saying contract. That's how oxytocin causes the rhythmic contractions of labor. And the oxytocin system is not just the hormone, but also the receptors. And as pregnancy advances, the whole system is activated. We get more oxytocin in our brain, more calm, connection, more anti-stress effects, actually. So Mother Nature's superb design is actually to reduce our stress in pregnancy. That's what we're imprinted with from this hormonal system. And it's very important, as Thomas said, and other speakers no doubt will say, because we don't want stress in pregnancy. Stress for the mother is communicated to the baby through various means, including the stress hormone cortisol. So oxytocin is important in pregnancy to dial down stress. And, you know, one of the important things for me about this day of pregnancy, the World Day of Pregnancy, is to focus on the needs of pregnant women, that we need to look after our pregnant women and reduce stress as much as possible. In one of the texts I read, the traditional advice was to think beautiful thoughts in pregnancy. And I think that's really important to reduce our stress, and oxytocin's there to help us with that as well. So the reason that oxytocin is so, we say, upregulated or activated in pregnancy is because of the increasing influence of the hormone estrogen, which I'm sure you've heard of as well. So estrogen levels go up in pregnancy, oxytocin levels go up, the uterus starts to get activated, and the brain is getting all of these calm, connecting, pain relieving actually effects as well. And in every mammalian species, oxytocin is actually a mammalian hormone. Every mammal, every being that suckles their young releases oxytocin. So oxytocin in pregnancy is also a social affiliative hormone. It triggers social behavior in all mammals. So you may even notice in pregnancy that you're a little bit more social. You're wanting to interact with people, talk about babies as well as growing babies. So oxytocin, that calm and connection, is also really important for dialing down stress, not just in terms of communicating stress to the baby and all those pre and perinatal impacts that Thomas talked about, but reducing stress in pregnancy also helps blood flow to the baby. You know, when we're stressed, our blood vessels constrict, and that can affect the baby. And we know that stress in pregnancy also increases the risk of preterm birth, increases the risk of, we call intrauterine growth retardation. The baby doesn't grow enough from not getting enough blood supply. So very important aspect of stress in labor is our own physiology that dials down that stress with oxytocin. So the more pregnant we become, the more activated our oxytocin system is. And I remember myself at the end of pregnancy being even like bovine, almost like a cow. Yeah, just that calmness that really is designed to happen at the end of pregnancy. And there's so many things I could say about the stress that the medical system, or what Michelle Odonk calls the nocebo effect, the negative effects of some of the stress and worry that the medical system imprints on women who are pregnant or people who are pregnant. And that includes that stress in the last stages of pregnancy to have your baby by a specific time. So if you can avoid that in some way, I recommend that. There's a whole lot of things I could say about optimizing your oxytocin system in pregnancy. And most of those are about having a good community, having a good caregiving system. For example, we know that having one-on-one care with your own midwife actually reduces the risk of preterm birth. And we think this is actually a stress reduction, oxytocin increasing, social affiliative effect as well. So we get to the end of pregnancy and we have this maximal activation of the oxytocin system, as I said, in the brain, but also in the body, because the body, the uterus in particular, is preparing for this magical moment, which is what I call the physiological, the spontaneous, the natural onset of labor. And the natural onset of labor is this absolute magical moment, and it's like the moment when you walk up the aisle, right? The moment of the wedding, the moment that it all happens, because all these preparations have been happening behind the scenes, if you like, you know. And I'm not going to talk about the effects of interventions. You can ask me questions about that. But, you know, inducing labor is like turning up at the church or wherever you get married a week beforehand and expecting everything to be the same, because there's so many preparations that happen. And in fact, these preparations are so complex that we don't even understand them. We don't actually know what causes the physiological onset of labor in humans. Yeah, so it's a little ironic that we're meddling with this so much. So that magical moment of the physiological onset of labor, the woman, the pregnant person's body is absolutely at the peak of readiness. And one of the reasons for this peak of readiness, or the mechanism, is what Thomas talked about, communication through the placenta that activates the baby, that where the baby system actually activates the mother's system. So I was talking about oxytocin and estrogen. The baby actually sends estrogen precursors, and the placenta makes those into estrogen, send them to the mother's body. The mother's body gets activated, gets prepared for labor and birth, gets more oxytocin through this communication through the placenta. So that's one of the biological communications that Thomas was talking about, through the placenta. And so the peak readiness of the mother is superbly coordinated with the peak readiness of the baby. It's a magical moment, we could say, a window of opportunity at the onset of labor. Now, as I mentioned, or I've mentioned, I'm doing a PhD in oxytocin, and one of the papers that we've published that I recommend you read is about levels of oxytocin as measured in the blood in physiological labor and birth when there's no interventions. And one of the interesting things that we found was that at that moment of the onset of labor, at an early labor, the mother's oxytocin levels are actually not very high. This was surprising to us. And what it reflects really is how ready the mother is, how maximally activated her oxytocin system is, how many oxytocin receptors she's got in her uterus. That will make her system, her uterus particularly, maximally sensitive. So even small amounts of oxytocin will cause efficient and effective contractions, because part of the activation, this magical moment, part of the intention of that is to have a safe and effective labor and birth. Yeah, so the oxytocin receptor upregulation or activation is really designed to maximize the effectiveness of that oxytocin that's released. So the contractions will start small, become bigger and bigger, and it reflects what I call the snowball of labor. Checking my time here. So the snowball of labor is that characteristic of labor that you may recognize, where it starts small, becomes bigger and bigger, and in the end becomes virtually unstoppable. And those of you who are pregnant and listening, I'm sure your babies are listening as well to this physiological process of labor. And this is how labor works. This is how we have the physiology to push our babies out at the end of labor. And by the way, that's oxytocin as well. So what actually happens in labor, and this is a brilliant design, is that the contractions start to happen and the sensory information, the sensations of labor are fed back to the brain by a specific nerve pathway. And when the information reaches the brain, it actually tells the brain to release more oxytocin. So we get more oxytocin released from the brain, travels to the uterus, finds the uterine contractions, causes stronger contractions, more sensations to the brain, more contractions. Yeah, so the stronger the sensations get, the more oxytocin is released to make the contractions stronger. So that's what builds the snowball of labor. Labor becomes so big, it becomes virtually unstoppable. And I've got to put this hint in here for those of you who are pregnant and listening to this. If you have to travel to hospital in labor, wait until the snowball is so big that it's unstoppable. And then when you going to hospital is not going to disrupt the whole pattern of labor, because oxytocin is a shy hormone. Yeah, as Michelle O'Donnell calls it, we don't release oxytocin when we feel afraid, when we don't feel safe. And this is actually a safety mechanism for mammals birthing in the wild. It's unsafe to give birth when the laboring female feels unsafe. There might be a predator nearby. It might not be a safe situation. So we have this exquisite sensitivity to our environment in labor, in pregnancy as well, actually, but particularly in labor. So going to hospital can slow down or even stop labor because we don't feel safe at this very primitive brain level. So if you wait until the snowball's so big it's unstoppable and then transfer to hospital, you're much less likely to get your whole labor derailed by that transfer, especially first-time pregnancies. But anyway, back to our oxytocin story. So as this snowball of labor builds, it's not just building oxytocin in the uterus, it's also building oxytocin in the brain. And this is fantastic, because what that means is as the labor gets stronger, as the contractions get stronger, the brain oxytocin release gets bigger as well. So we get more pain relief, more calming, more analgesic effects. It's really Mother Nature's help for every laboring female mammal. Other mammals, they don't go to classes to learn how to take care of their babies. It all happens through this process of labor and birth. Okay, so we get this increase in brain oxytocin, not just calming, connecting, and pain relieving, but critically switching on the reward and pleasure centers in the brain, those dopamine centers in the brain. And what this does is activate all of those maternal behaviors after the birth. And basically what happens is, at that moment of birth, those strong contractions are causing maximal brain oxytocin. And that maximal brain oxytocin is maximally activating the pleasure and reward centers. The baby or babies, mammalian babies, come out. The mother gets those sensory information from the babies, the sound, the sight, the taste. Actually, most mammals lick their babies. And that gets, we say, fired and wired, connected up with the reward and pleasure centers in the brain. And the baby is from the beginning a source of reward and pleasure for the mother. And that's what has every mammalian mother take care of her babies, because it feels good. Yeah. And that's our hormonal blueprint as humans, as women, as birthing people as well, that our babies are from the beginning a source of reward and pleasure because of this maximal activation of the reward and pleasure centers through oxytocin peaks in labor and birth. But of course, it doesn't just stop then. We've just given birth to the baby, and that first hour after birth is also a magical time. It's what we call biologically an early sensitive period, or we could call it a window of opportunity, because the mother's had these peak levels of oxytocin in the brain. She's maximally wired to, we could say, fall in love or bond or attach or take care of her babies. But the other partner we're talking about here, particularly the baby, and this was a finding from the most recent review we did, the baby actually has high levels of oxytocin at birth, and they're even higher than the mother. So think about that. The baby's even more wired to fall in love with the mother, but the baby also has all of that calming, connecting, pain relieving, activating effects during labor as well. And we think that two things contribute to that. One is, and actually Thomas's story illustrated this beautifully, is the massage-like effects of the contractions on the baby. Yeah. So it could be a positive sensation for the baby. And the second thing is the inevitable stress of labor and birth, because for every mammal, I'm talking about placental mammals, not the marsupials in Australia, but for every placental mammal, there's only one way out of the womb, and that's through the rhythmic contractions of labor that push the baby out. And these contractions inevitably squeeze not only the baby, but also the placenta. And by squeezing the placenta, they reduce blood and oxygen supply. So there's an inevitable stress from being born. But that stress has a positive benefit for the baby. It actually prepares the baby for life outside the womb. It protects the baby from the strong contractions. Yeah, so in 65 million years of placental mammalian evolution has made these processes very protective for the baby to make sure that the baby comes out in a good way. So the stress of labor, the hypoxic, the low oxygen stress also stimulates oxytocin for the baby. So in that moment after birth, as they meet each other, I say it's like the best first date ever. The mother has these maximal oxytocin levels. The baby has these maximal oxytocin levels. They're designed to meet, to be skin to skin with each other, which further promotes oxytocin for both of them. And then as the baby gets on the mother's body, those pre-breastfeeding behaviors, I recommend you Google breast crawl. There's some beautiful videos of the baby crawling up the mother's breast body. And what does the baby do? The baby starts to massage the mother's nipples, and that stimulates more oxytocin for the mother, even up to 10 times what it was at birth. So that oxytocin is beneficial, taking time for the not just the interactions between mother and baby and the breastfeeding initiation and the attachment, but it also literally saves the mother's life by still causing those strong contractions that prevent bleeding. So the mother's oxytocin increases at that time, and it also benefits the baby because, and I think someone's mentioned this already, but oxytocin as a calming, pain relieving, actually stress reducing hormone also activates the parasympathetic nervous system, and that promotes blood flow to the skin. And in these moments after birth, there's actually a specific flush that the new mother gets up her body, her chest, her breast, even her cheeks. If you notice in photos of women who've just given birth, become a bit pink. And this mechanism actually on her chest, as the baby comes to her chest and her breasts, literally pulses heat to her baby. And that's the magic of skin to skin contact. It keeps the baby warmer than anything we can wrap the baby in or put the baby under, because the mother's body heat is keeping the baby warm. And for these millions of years of mammalian evolution, there's nowhere else for the baby to be except on the mother's body, being kept warm by the mother's pulsing heat, yeah, to the baby. And then with these peaks of oxytocin, we have this perfect physiology actually for the mother and the baby, not just to fall in love, the best first date ever, but to initiate, to interact as a social affiliative hormone, and then to initiate breastfeeding. The baby gets calm, the baby gets relaxed through skin to skin, the baby gets curious, as you'll see in those videos. The baby finds the breast, it smells like amniotic fluid, massage the nipple, and eventually attaches and suckles. And that's the ideal start to breastfeeding. And if we start messing with birth, I won't say much more, but we can start messing with breastfeeding as well. And I'm almost at the end of my time, but I want to mention one study that really highlights the early sensitive period here. So this study was done where they randomized babies to skin contact with the mother for the first 2 hours, or they wrapped the babies up and put them in a nursery. This was in Russian maternity hospitals. And then they actually brought the mothers and babies back together at 1 year, and they videotaped the interactions. And those mothers and babies, those dyads that had had skin-to-skin contact, had better interactions. The babies had better emotional regulation. And this all comes from that intervention, we could say, or that Mother Nature's superb design that happened in that first 2 hours. So it is a magical moment, and it's designed to work. Your body is designed to work, is my take-home message. Oxytocin, neurobiology, that is all a part of it. And that's my 20 minutes up, but I look forward to your questions as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah. Why we just have 20 minutes? That's a shame. With the wonder of people we have here, it's unbelievable. So just perhaps I will expose you, because there is people have I believe get the chats, and so now we have a lot of questions on the chat. I will just give you a kind of a bucket of all these questions and pick up what you feel, because we don't have much time to answer to all of them, and I believe you have covered many things. For the first question was is about is there impact of the oxytocin on the future health of the baby and the later adults? What can pregnant women do to promote the promotion of natural oxytocin during pre-labor and labor? You have covered that a bit. Does oxytocin play a specific role during the postpartum period as well? How do you see the hospital intervention during labor? Perhaps I will just give you a first
topic.
And we have others that are very interesting too. Perhaps if some of them pick you up a certain answer.
Yeah. So maybe we'll talk about optimizing oxytocin. So my hint was the snowball of labor. If you wait until the snowball's as big as, so big it's unstoppable before you go to hospital, that's going to optimize oxytocin and also reduce your chance of interventions. Interventions is a big topic, but most interventions do have some impact on the oxytocin system, either by increasing stress or actually with epidurals. If we go back to our positive feedback loop, if you remember, it's the sensations from the uterus that feed back to the brain that release oxytocin from the brain. So the problem with epidurals is they're so effective. Well, the good thing and the bad thing is they're so effective at reducing sensations. Basically no sensations, therefore no feedback, therefore oxytocin levels go down. And this is what I'm working on right now, actually. And not just oxytocin as measured in the blood, but we're reducing brain oxytocin release as well. And in animal studies, when you give sheep or cows epidurals, they don't bond with their babies, or their ability to bond is dramatically reduced, especially first time. So some of these interventions, and the model I use, I say that interventions can cause a hormonal gap. Something didn't happen that shouldn't have happened, and something didn't happen that should have happened, or epidurals reducing oxytocin. So I guess generally to address those hormonal gaps, there's two things we can do. One is skin to skin. If you remember, I mentioned that skin to skin releases oxytocin. So if you have one of these interventions, a pre-labor cesarean people mentioned, where there's not even the preparation, skin to skin will release oxytocin for you and your baby to some extent, not as much as if you have a physiological birth. So skin to skin. And the second thing is breastfeeding, because every time that the mother breastfeeds her baby, she releases oxytocin through the letdown reflex, and the baby also gets oxytocin through the act of suckling, through the skin-to-skin contact. So breastfeeding and skin-to-skin are the two ways, Mother Nature's backup systems, if you like, to fill in those hormonal gaps. So that's some of the questions that have been asked. Synthetic oxytocin, that's a whole subject in itself. I wrote a whole paper about that. You can go to my website, sarahbuckley.com, look at all the science. You can find the link to all of those papers that were published. And cesareans, obviously, yes, big hormonal gaps, more with a pre-labor cesarean than an in-labor cesarean. Epidural, big hormonal gap. yeah, no oxytocin. I think I've covered most of that. Yeah. Oxytocin during the postpartum period. Yeah. So skin to skin and breastfeeding, every time that we do that, we release oxytocin. And just one more thing, which is to say that if we're addressing these hormonal gaps, we've missed that window of opportunity. We've missed that magical moment, right? So what we have to do to address the hormonal gaps is more work. And I'm just going to finish with an anecdote. This was a mama who had one natural birth, or two natural births actually, and then had a pre-labor cesarean. And she said, when I got my baby back after the cesarean, my baby felt different. The baby was in a different hormonal state from all the things we've said. She said, my instinct was to have my baby skin to skin. And after 3 days of skin to skin, my baby felt the same. So if you want to fill in the hormonal gaps, you're going to have to be patient. Lots of skin to skin and lots of breastfeeding as well. And filling in those hormonal gaps is a benefit not just to you in the short term, but also in the long term. You're going to help to knit back some of those attachment, reward, and pleasure systems that you would have missed in the labor and birth.
Hey, thank you so much, Sarah. This has been so informative, and the pregnant women that are listening to you are so lucky. It's very practical, and do share this lecture with everyone you know, for the audience listening. So thank you so much.